All right. Hi, everybody. I'm going to give a few minutes, maybe a minute or so for our participants to come in. I see them popping in now, so we'll just give it a little bit of time for people to get logged in.
And I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in today. My name is Brandon. I'm one of the ports coordinators, and we're super excited to have you all tuning in to explore the wildfire ecology of the Lake Tahoe Basin. So thank you guys, and feel free to tune in to any of our other home learning programs. We offer them regularly, and we couldn't do this without you, the students and the public. So our appreciation goes out to you.
Definitely. All right. The sign-ins seem to have plateaued, so I think that might be a good sign to go ahead and kick it off. But hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Doss. Thank you for joining California State Parks today as we talk about the fascinating topic of fire ecology. I'm your host, Hannah, Park Interpretive Specialist at Donner Memorial State Park and Sugar Pine Point State Park. Starting out today, I'll help you answer the questions, what is a prescribed burn and how is it different from a wildfire? Then we'll have Courtney Rowe come speak to us about her role as a California State Park senior environmental scientist in the Sierra District. She'll also talk about her personal experience with the Caldor fire that burned over 200,000 acres in the Tahoe area this past summer, and what California State Parks is doing to plan for wildfire resiliency. After Courtney, we'll have Darcy Page, Park Interpretive Specialist for Plumas Eureka State Park, and she'll teach us about the original stewards of the land, the Native Americans, and how they managed the forest with fire. If you have any questions today, please use the Q&A function, as we cannot see or hear you, and then we'll have a mediator ask those questions on your behalf. So let me get you warmed up with a few questions. So in the Q&A, type the answer to this question. Do you think wildfire is good or bad? Put good or bad in the Q&A. Let's see what you think. Oh, I'm seeing some both good, bad. Yeah, so it's both basically. It just depends on what the wildfire is doing. And we're going to talk more and learn more about that today. So I'm going to share my presentation and we're going to talk about what is needed to start a fire off first here. So sharing my screen. All right. Welcome to our event. All right. So this is the fire triangle, the three things that are needed to make a fire. Type your answers to the following questions in the Q&A. So what is an example of a fuel that may start a fire? Can you think of a fuel that naturally occurs outside? So what are some things that are outside that could be fuels? Type that in the chat. Let's see what you say. Scroll down. Wood, yeah, definitely. Dry grass. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, brush, definitely. Pine cones, pine needles. All right, can you think of something that can act as a spark or a form of heat to start a fire? Let's think in the kind of the realm of the outdoors. So what in nature can start a fire? Can start that spark? Yeah, somebody with a campfire, lightning, maybe a very hot day, dry conditions. Yeah, very good. Awesome. So now that you know how fire is created, let's talk about its effect on the Sierra Nevada mountains and where we are today. The climate here has changed a lot, both environmentally and culturally. So first, let's focus on how the environment has changed by focusing on the more recent history of trees and fire in the area. So the California Gold Rush began on January 24th, 1848, when gold was found by James W. Marshall at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. The news of gold brought approximately 300,000 people to California from the rest of the US and even abroad. This influx of people hunting gold meant that houses and gold mines needed to be built. This meant a lot of trees were cut down to serve as lumber to build those things. 80% of the trees were cut down in the Lake Tahoe area. So once the trees did finally start to grow back, they all grew back at about the same time. This means that there was little age diversity or species diversity in the new forest. Diverse forests are better for our plants and our wildlife. There also began the idea that wildfire is bad, and wildfires began to be suppressed. When fires are suppressed, fuels like pine cones and dry pine needles stack up on the ground. In some places, these fuels have been stacking up for over 100 years. That's bad because when a place with a lot of fuel on the ground catches fire, it burns really, really hot. Very hot fires or mega fires are the worst kind of fires. So, what do low temperature or low intensity fires look like? I'm going to show you in a video. All right, you can see the flames are really low. There's not a ton of smoke in the air. The snowpack, as you can see all around me, helps keep those flames really small. It looks pretty manageable, right? Just burning up the dead stuff on the ground, not climbing the trees. Yeah, so that's a low temperature fire. Now let's look at what a high temperature fire or a mega fire looks like. All right, you can see the sky's already orange. The flames are much taller, a lot more smoke. Very thick smoke in the air. Now these flames are starting to climb the trunks of these trees. It looks pretty out of control, right? Yeah, it looks pretty scary, something we would not want to be around. So there's a big difference between low temperature and high temperature fires and how the flames actually move through the forest. So surface fires, as you can see in that second rectangle, surface fires spread quickly and through the brush, but they stay low to the ground. They just burn up grasses, shrubs, needles, cones, logs, etc. Now, if the area with a surface fire has been burned within the last 10 years or so, the temperatures in these fires normally are pretty low and they just clean the ground of all the extra fuel. So these are really good fires and they're actually necessary for the health of the forest. So in this second to last rectangle, right there, you can see that the fire starts to climb up the trees, right? Ladder fuels are small to medium-sized fires, medium-sized trees, and shrubs that bring the fire from the surface of the ground and move the fire up the ladder towards the top of the trees. This can be really bad because they can cause crown fires. So in this last rectangle, you'll see crown fires are when the bottom leaves of the bigger trees catch fire and then the fire climbs up the tree. These will most likely result in a wildfire that burns everything because the temperatures are so hot. This is also called a megafire. The high temperatures will even kill the happy bacteria in the soil that helps plants grow. So here's a local example of how a megafire kills everything. This photo was just taken a few months ago, but the fire came through about 15 years ago. See how no trees have regrown? Adult trees make baby trees, and when all of the adult trees are burned up, they can't resow seeds that will make new trees. So, what is happening in our environment currently that might make the conditions right for more wildfires? You can put it in the Q&A. And if you're thinking global warming and climate change, bingo, you got it. So, we've got drought, right? Which means less rain and less snowpack. Less water means more plants die. Warmer temperatures equal a longer growing season and a longer fire season. And so when more plants grow and then the temperatures are staying warm, some bugs are actually not dying with the lack of the colder temperatures, which equal infestations, plants die. So all of this equals more plants dying. More plants growing, more plants dying, which equal more fuels on the ground and more risk for megafires. So you can help limit climate change. So you can use less energy and water. You can turn off the lights and TVs when you leave the room, turn off the water when you brush your teeth. You can plant trees in areas that need trees. When you're old enough to drive, or if you're purchasing a car, you can drive electric cars or take public transportation. You can walk, you can eat more vegetables. They have less of an environmental impact than beef does. You can throw less food away, and then, of course, reduce, reuse, repair, and recycle. So, what can we do to save the forest and put it back to where it has a good relationship with fire? We can do something called a prescribed burn. So, what is a prescribed burn? Prescribed burning is good fire. It is a low temperature fire that we have more control over because fire scientists start the fire on purpose. It has several steps so that we can try to avoid a mega fire. It's how we protect the parks from bad fire. So it has several steps. Fire scientists come in, they thin out the forest by hand, they pile up the debris, and some of it dries out for an entire year. Now, they are really careful to keep a certain ratio of old growth to new baby trees out in the forest, also a diversity in species. And if a tree has a bad disease or bad insects, they make that one of the trees they do cut down. So they're really particular about which trees go. Now I'm going to show you a video. So after they thinned out the fuel in the forest, they get clearance to burn from people who monitor our air quality. The fire scientists burn small amounts of the forest at a time and stand by with the ability to fight the fire in case something gets out of hand. If the air quality is bad or the weather is too risky for a burn, then it is rescheduled. Now I wanted to show you really quick a time lapse of a prescribed burn and how the plants regrow in just the next 2 months. So you'll see the smoke moving in here in just a second. And then you'll see how in just 2 months, the forest really recovers. All right. So you can see a little bit of the smoke. You can see the flames kind of move in. They're staying really low. They're not climbing up the trees, not killing the bigger trees, just cleaning up the ground. And then in just 2 months, look how things are already really growing back. You can't even tell if a fire really came through there, right? Awesome. So now that you've learned a lot about wildfires versus prescribed burns, let's talk to the senior environmental scientist for California State Parks in the Sierra District, Courtney Rowe. So if you have any questions for Courtney specifically, please put them in the Q&A with the name Courtney in front of them and then your question. And at the very end, you'll have a chance to ask Darcy and I questions. All right. Hi, Courtney. How are you today?
Hi, Hannah. Pretty good. How are you?
Awesome. Thank you. So can you please describe your role as an environmental scientist in the California State Parks Lake Tahoe area?
Yeah, so as a senior environmental scientist, I'm actually our ecology program lead, and I work hand in hand with our district's forester to help plan ecological restoration. And one component of that for us is restoring a forest. In the Sierra, one of the main process that's missing from our forest, because the vast majority of our forests up here are adapted to fire. So what these forests are missing is fire. And how do we, based on all the information you just provided, bring fire back onto a landscape where fire and sometimes has been absent for over 100 years. The forest that we see up here, particularly our Jeffrey pine and our ponderosa pine, the fire return interval, or how frequently we would have seen fire historically, is in the range of 10 to 40 years. But in a lot of our forests now, it's been over 150 years since a fire has moved through them. So my job as an ecologist is how can we in state parks restore that process through mimicking the effects of fire, or when possible, conducting prescribed burns.
Awesome. Can you share with us your career path and how you became a resource ecologist in the High Sierras?
Um, so I started out as a dirtbag, as a dirtbag raft guide intern.
Nice.
I actually have a undergraduate degree in geomorphology, which is the study of landform change, which caused my interest in streams. And then I went to work for the National Park Service in Golden Gate National Recreation Area as an unpaid intern in a native plant nursery and learned a lot about ecological restoration. So from there, I spent about 8 years with the Park Service working on ecological restoration of streams. And then I moved to the Forest Service, where I worked as a botanist here in the Sierra on the Lake Tahoe Basin and Plumas National Forests. And in that role, that's when I actually got my firefighter qualification. So gosh, it's almost like 12 years ago, more than that. 15 years ago, I went through the process of becoming a firefighter myself so I could understand how fire works on the landscape. Since fire is the largest process that dominates the forests in the Sierra, I wanted to know what it looked like to fight fire. So once I got my qualifications as a firefighter, I started working very regularly every summer, 1 to 2 months of the year, on large incidents. So that's where they bring in an incident management team to fight the fire. And my role generally in that has been someone who advises on resources. So I help the firefighters make decisions about cultural and natural resources and how we can protect those things during the fire. But also during that time at the Forest Service, I was able to work on prescribed burns with our fuels folks and really get to hold a drip torch in my hand myself, light fires, go through the process of understanding how challenging it is to get a prescribed burn logistically up and running. And from that, about 2 years ago, I moved over to state parks to take this ecology program position, mostly because state parks has an exemplary track record in the Lake Tahoe Basin for prescribed burning. The burn program here, under the direction of Rich Adams, and folks before him, has been ongoing for 30 plus years. So we have a lot of plots in around the Lake Tahoe Basin where we are able to do reentry interval burns that are approximating that natural fire regime, places where in the last 30 years we've burned places 2 and 3 times, which means we are really on track on a lot of our lands of getting back in touch with that natural rhythm of fire here, of really restoring fire as a process on the landscape. So that's my background and how I came to it. This last year, I actually got to spend time on the Tamarack Fire and the Caldor Fire, which were both here in the Lake Tahoe Basin, doing that role of advising firefighters on how to address natural resources, and then also actually doing fast-paced habitat restoration after the fire leaves of the suppression impacts that happen from fire. So oftentimes we fight fire with bulldozers these days, and those dozer lines that we leave can leave just as big of an impact as the fire in certain areas. So I work with firefighters on how to repair the damage from things like dozer lines after a fire, so we don't have, after some of these catastrophic impacts from a fire, catastrophic impacts from mudslides, debris flows, erosion.
So you mentioned the Caldor fire, which actually leads us into our next question. So in 2021, California wildfires burned over 2.5 million acres. So can you share your experience in responding to the Caldor fire that burned over 200,000 acres and threatened the South Lake Tahoe area?
Sure. I want to start by saying we are in an entirely human created and brand new fire regime. So when I talk about the historic fire regimes that used to be in the Sierra, we are now in an entirely different era. In the last 20, how should I say this? Of the 20 largest wildfires in California history, 18 of them have happened in the last 20 years, which
Wow.
means we are now at a point where fire looks entirely different in California than it used to look like historically, or before Western colonization and a huge amount of fire suppression came into place. Before that, when I talk about a fire regime of that 10 to 40 year interval for our yellow pine forests, that was before 100 to 150 years of what we have now, fire suppression. So fire suppression, if you guys haven't heard that term, is where fire is suppressed instead of managed. So suppressed means we come in with all the resources possible, aircraft, bulldozers, firefighters on the ground, and put the fire out almost usually as fast as we can immediately. The Forest Service actually used to have this thing called the 10 a.m. rule, where they would want wildfires put out by 10 a.m. the next day. Well, in in California, where the vast majority of our plant communities are adapted to fire, if we've been putting out or suppressing fires for 100 to 150 years, and it was actually codified in California law that it would be the policy of California to suppress fires for a while. It's not our policy now, but it used to be. That has vastly changed what we're seeing. So what we're starting to see are these mega fires. Generally, a mega fire is a fire over 100,000 acres. When I started, as a firefighter, or when I got my fire quals 15 years ago, it was rare to see a fire of 100,000 acres, and it is regularly routine now. So the fires that we're seeing are not the fires that would have been part of the natural, not natural, the prehistoric fire regime of the Sierra. But it's hard to go just immediately back to that. You know, we have people, homes, uh, living in places where they weren't living 150 years ago, and that is a reality that we have to address. So this summer, when I was on the Caldor, I was called by the Forest Service because I've worked in the Lake Tahoe Basin for almost 10 years now to help them sort of make some decisions about how we could best fight the fire, particularly around watershed impacts. Everybody knows that the clarity of Lake Tahoe is a pretty big concern for our community, and it's honestly a national treasure, the clarity of Lake Tahoe. And people were very concerned both with the size of fire coming into the basin, but also the impacts of building miles and miles of dozer line. You know, when you build a dozer line, it's usually built straight up a hill or across a ridge in an area that if you allowed water to flow down those things without vegetation, there's going to be a lot of erosion and a lot of potential impacts to the lake. So when you add the potential impacts of having a burned landscape and then having fire suppression impacts, you know, building dozer lines, and those are kind of a dual hazard that come to the ecosystem after a fire. So I came in to help them with that. So a lot of what I was doing was addressing where we decided to build dozer line, when and why. And then the big part that people don't always know about is that an incident management team is responsible for fixing or repairing that dozer line before they leave a fire, or at least coming up with a plan for how to do that. So when there was 200 plus miles of dozer line built by an incident management team, those have to be fixed. And what do I mean by fixed? We are usually we are recontouring it back to its natural grade, bringing back vegetation after the fire risk has dissipated, so that we have a barrier to some of the rain impacts. A single drop of rain can bounce back 4 feet. So you can imagine there's a lot of erosive power to the large rain events, especially in October. We had a big rain event up here. That's a lot of soil that can end up in Lake Tahoe. So I work with them. A lot of our fires, they're amazing folks, but they aren't also ecologists, geomorphologists, archaeologists. So they bring folks like me to help them understand what we need to do to repair those things before the entire fire management infrastructure leaves. So that's how I spent, oh gosh, a solid like month and a half of my summer.
Very cool. And that actually relates to our next question as well. Can you talk about what California state parks and other land management agencies are doing to manage complex forest ecosystems and to plan for wildfire resiliency?
Well, we're very, very lucky that the governor signed the California, I'm going to get him, Forest and Wildfire Resilience Plan this last year, which allowed a bunch of funds to be opened up for organizations like Cal Fire and California State Parks to look at how we can address and manage fuels, and how we can actually try to get more fire on the landscape. The vast majority of that money is actually going to go to fuels management. So there should be should have a clarification. There is a desire by a lot of people to restore fire, but a lot of times that's not possible because of existing infrastructure, and honestly, because of social mores. In a way, people are still not comfortable with the idea of a fire burning in their backyard, even though that's probably what's necessary to protect their home. So it is actually much easier for us to address the fuel component more than restoring fire a lot of the time. So a lot of that money is going to be spent to removing ladder fuels. It goes back to that diagram that you showed, the fuels that are on the ground, small fuels, small trees, dead branches, removing a lot of that material, and either chipping it or piling it for burning later, or hopefully at some point we'll have a virgin biomass industry that can address that and use that for heat. That would be ideal. We don't have that infrastructure yet in Lake Tahoe, so a lot of that money is going to addressing fuels, particularly around people's homes. One of the things that this last fire season has really taught us is that on one hand, we could do as much fuels management as we wanted to out in the forest, and we still may not be able to protect people's homes if we are not dealing with having defensible space and hardened homes in our communities. And when I mean hardening a home, it's changing certain components of the home to make sure that it's more resistant to wildfire, but also managing fuels around people's homes. Lots of people come to the Sierra to live in a place where they have trees in their backyard hanging over their home. Those also present a fire risk to that particular home. So our partners at CAL FIRE are really working to address that. Where can we build defensible space? So that is areas that are clear to fuels around people's homes. And how can we really engage people to harden their homes so that it survives during a wildfire? So particularly in California state parks, both Rich Adams and I are working on projects to increase the scale that we do the fuels treatment and burning that you had highlighted in your photos. And like I said, people shouldn't be surprised if a lot of this work is more around managing the fuels. Me personally, as an ecologist, I would love to see us move towards more burning, but we can't just go out right now and light a match in a forest that has had fuels accumulating for 100 and 150 years. That's what's leading to these high severity megafires. So we need to reduce that fuel loading first before we can restore an ecology and our natural balance with fire. The other thing I should say is that we have a lot of really cool historic stuff here, like Vikings home, some really cool historic structures. And we are working with our cultural staff to figure out ways that we can harden those structures so that, it's not if, it's when a wildfire comes. This ecology is adapted to fire. It's not if, it's when. So when that comes, how can we protect things like important cultural resources so that they're here for the next generation?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Courtney. Brandon, do we have any questions for Courtney from the Q&A?
Yes, we do. And we're going to actually have Jeremy ask those questions to Courtney.
Okay.
Hey, Courtney. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. I got a few questions coming in the chat. Just want to make sure we cover these. All right. So we have a couple questions about prescribed burns. So do these prescribed burns happen in our public parks? And if so, do these parks close during these burns?
Great question. Absolutely, these burns happen in our park, and oftentimes an area around the burn will happen if we're burnt or will be closed. We'll generally have a perimeter set around those that we keep people out of, but it won't necessarily close the rest of the park. For example, when we burn piles in sugar pine, we're often doing it with snow on the ground. So oftentimes it's a time when there's not a lot of visitor use anyway, but we will close a perimeter around those areas. But oftentimes, I know what happens is a lot of people will end up driving by, reporting these things, going, oh my God, I'm seeing smoke, the forest is on fire. And we work really hard to get up signs that say manage fire, prescribe fire. But fire still has that sort of like deep-seated human fear or connection to it, that people see fire and their heart skips a beat. So we're working with our interpreters like Hannah and Darcy and Jeremy to help people understand that there is some risk to the public being around we're doing this prescribed burning, but the essence of a prescribed burn is that it's done by a prescription. So we are only going to burn these areas when we have fuels, wind, personnel in alignment. If we don't have the resources, those are the human resources that we need, if the winds are too strong, if the fuels are too wet or too dry, we're not going to be burning in those conditions. That's what makes prescribed burning different than, say, a managed fire or a wildfire. So, if I could send like one thing out today, it's that I want people to start to become more comfortable at seeing managed and prescribed fire near where they are, and knowing that, no, as managers, we don't know the absolute answer. I'm never going to tell you it's quote unquote safe, but that we have a lot of barriers in place to reduce the risk to human health and safety when we're doing our prescribed burning.
All right, excellent. Thank you. We've got another question, Courtney, for you. So do you live in the Lake Tahoe area? And if so, do you enjoy living up in the Sierras?
Oh, it's terrible. You can see it. Let's see it. That's That's my life on like a given Wednesday in the winter when my leg's not broken. It's just terrible living here. No, it's wonderful living in Tahoe. It's hard, as these ladies can probably also attest. We have a terrible housing crisis right now. It's extremely expensive. It's really hard for anyone to get staff right now. But most of us live here because it's our passion and our joy. And I could make a lot more money someplace else, but I really believe in the work that I do. I want to be a public servant, and I get paid in sunsets and ski runs, and that's not a bad thing.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you, Courtney. So we've got one last question for you, which also might be a good segue here. Sorry if we can't answer all these questions. We'll try to do our best to answer them in the chat. But one last question, which is kind of a segue. When did humans begin their prescribed burning?
Time immemorial in California. Honestly, it is one of the unfortunate things that happened in California is when colonizers stepped in and decided to stop native burning practices. There's a long history, there's a huge amount of evidence that the fire ecology, that's why I say prehistoric, or I don't want to say natural fire regime, because humans have been managing fire in the Sierra for millennia, and they often been doing it in a tribal tribes in this area have been burning for a number of different reasons. I'm going to let Darcy talk about that more, but it's been happening a lot in state parks. It's been about 30 years since we've had a prescribed burn program in the Sierra, and across California, actually Yosemite is one of the oldest prescribed burn programs in the entire country. It was really in the last 50 years, as we've seen data come in decoupling the size of fires from climate, that we're, sorry, I'm getting a little wonky there, that we've started to realize that restoring fire is really important for the ecosystem, and that while fire suppression is a necessary thing around certain people's homes, across the entire landscape, it's the main contributing factor leading to the mega fires that we're seeing. And one term I wanted to kind of distinguish that we didn't really talk about is the difference between a high severity fire and a mega fire. So a mega fire is anything over 100,000 acres. There are actually high severity fires in some places in the Western US that are completely part of the prehistoric fire regime. They're not that common in California, although there are some ecosystems that need them. Lodgepole pine, for example. A lot of California is actually more adapted to low severity fire. So that's lower fire impacts. But just because there's a lot of trees that are dead for a given ecosystem, that might actually be the right type of fire. Lodgepoles in particular, they need stand replacing fires, or the entire forest burn down in order for them to regenerate. And if we have people joining who live in the Pacific Northwest or parts of the deserts, high severity fire ecosystems are actually there are natural systems that look like that. Yeah. I wanted to answer that because someone did ask the question, why hadn't fires burned in 150 years if they're ideally wanted every 10 to 20 years? And I wanted to really emphasize that 10 to 40 years is really for this ecosystem, this forest type. It will be different if you live in Chaparral. It will be different if you live in the Pacific Northwest. It'll be different if you live in a different ecosystem. And why we haven't burned 150 years is really humans suppressed fire for a long period of time in California.
Thank you again, Courtney, for your time. So now it's time for our next guest speaker, Darcy Page, Park and Terp Specialist from the Plumas Eureka State Park area. She's going to teach us about Native people and of the Plumas area and their cultural burning processes. So take it away, Darcy.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Hannah and Courtney, for that excellent introduction. Hopefully I'll be able to answer some of those questions in the chat about fire suppression in this next segment. So again, my name is Darcy. I'm the park interpreter at Plumas Eureka State Park. And I'm going to be discussing the history of prescribed fire in this region and how it is a powerful element in managing healthy, flourishing forests, and also about cultural burning and how cultural burning is a practice that's been used for thousands of years. Courtney says millennia, since time immemorial, as far back as human history can remember. The indigenous caretakers of this land, in my park, that's the Mountain Maidu, have been caring for this landscape through burns and continues to this day. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the mountain Maidu are the original and most experienced stewards of this land, and that Plumas Eureka State Park sits on the traditional territory of the mountain Maidu people. I won't be speaking as specifically to the indigenous groups in the rest of the Tahoe region, but from my understanding, the Lake Tahoe region is the traditional territory of the Miwok, the Maidu, the Nisenan, and Washoe peoples. And a lot of their practices, there's definitely a lot of overlap in prescriptive burns and these cultural burns. I should say cultural burns. So I'm going to start out with a cool fact about fire ecology. So most plants and animals in the United States have adaptations that allow them to survive some fire impacts. In fact, 70% of California's ecosystems are adapted to fire. So we're going to talk specifically about a couple plants that are adapted to those low intensity fires. And we're going to jump in a little more deeply into some of those yellow pine communities that Courtney mentioned. And so for all my students out there in the chat, or sorry, in the Q&A, if you could go ahead and answer this question, help me remember, what exactly is an adaptation? I'd love to see some responses in the Q&A. What is an adaptation? What does that fancy science word mean? And while you do that, I'm going to change my background so you guys can see my collection of pine cones I'm going to share with you all. Something that adapts to change, someone said, getting used to their environment, something that develops to help it survive. Totally, those are all great answers. So an adaptation is a trait that fits any living thing into its environment. And we are specifically talking about fire, right? So I'm going to share 3 species. I'm going to share their pine cones, and these are all species that are adapted to fire in our ecosystem. So the first one I'm going to start out with is the smallest in our park, the smallest pine cone. The trees all look very similar, and I'll share their adaptations after I share their pine cones. So this pine cone is a little bit prickly. You can see the barbs kind of poke out, and that's how it gets its nickname of the prickly ponderosa pine. So this is the ponderosa pine cone. It's about the size of my fist, and it has really sharp barbs that poke out. The second pine cone I want to share with you guys is a bit bigger, about the size of my face, maybe half the size of my head. And if you look closely at the barbs, they're actually curved down and inward. So it's really soft and gentle to touch. And I call this one, a lot of people call this one the gentle Jeffrey. So this is a Jeffrey pine, another yellow pine, also adapted to fire, just like the ponderosa. And my third, final, last but not least, the pine that has the biggest pine cone in the world is the sugar pine. These pine cones, the biggest one on record that I saw in the Guinness Book was almost 2 feet long, so almost twice as big as this one. Massive, massive pine cones. Again, all 3 of these are adapted to fire, and they have some similar adaptations. One is that they all have really thick bark. It comes off in these scaly sort of puzzle piece shapes that can kind of fit together on the tree. And this helps as a protective barrier against those lower severity fires. If one comes through the forest and it's not too high intensity of a fire, those outer scales will burn off, kind of like a scab on your skin, but the inner part of the bark, the heartwood of the tree, will remain healthy and unburned. Let me show you guys an image here of the bark up close. So here you can see on my side a close-up of that thick fire-resistant bark. All of these trees, this bark looks very similar. And they also have another really cool fire adaptation, which is that all of these trees, they actually shed their lower branches in a self-pruning adaptation. So those lower branches, as you can see, on this trunk, they don't start growing until it's pretty high up on the tree. Now that is a pretty neat adaptation for a lot of reasons. Anyone have any guesses you could put in the Q&A? Why would that be a good fire adaptation for a tree that can survive in smaller, lower severity fires? If you've got any guesses, feel free to put it in the Q&A. It has a lot to do with what Hannah and Courtney were talking about with those ladder fuels. So if all of my limbs grow higher up on the tree, then those ladder fuels are less likely to creep up and create a crown fire at the tip top of the tree. And that keeps all our fires closer to the ground and lower burning. Yeah, so pretty cool to learn that all these plants, multiple plants and animals that have adaptations to fire. And fire must have been around for a long time in order for these plants to develop these adaptations. I want you all to imagine the forests here thousands of years ago. And go ahead and put in the chat, how would a fire start a long time ago? How would fires get started? Lightning, yes, ding, 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 absolutely. Lightning is a totally natural way that fires would start on the landscape. It's a natural occurrence. And here's another question for you. Were there people here thousands and thousands of years ago on this landscape? Go ahead and put that in the Q&A for me. Yes, yes, Native Americans, absolutely. The mountain Maidu that I mentioned earlier, that's the indigenous group that lived and still lives on this landscape today. And the mountain Maidu used fire and still do because they knew and know that this land is adapted to fire, and they use fire as a land management tool. So there have been thousands of years of burning on this landscape from indigenous people. Let me share another nice little map with you all. So this is kind of a basic outline of Northern California. You can see the brown outline is Maidu territory, and then this red dot represents Plumas Eureka State. So we are solidly in mountain Maidu territory here at the park. And fire was one of their most important practices. That is called cultural burning, when an indigenous group intentionally sets fire to a landscape. Now, these groups set fire for a multitude of different reasons: to roast and cook food, to clear a camp at the end of the season, for spiritual practices and rituals, and to keep the forest open. One of the things that is kind of more dramatic about when we imagine a landscape that had more cultural burning, we can imagine an increased production of grasses and flowers, which provided food for people, for deer, for basket weaving. Now, these fires were low intensity. They were typically frequent and not burning the soil, but just the top layer of duff, which is pine cones, and the leaf, or I should say the pine needle litter that is on the forest floor. And these fires would be set after a rain or two so that the ground would be slightly wetter, or in the winter, which is known as a cold burn. These small intensity fires created more open forest pockets, which helps prevent larger fires. And this is a common practice for other Native American groups throughout the Sierra Nevada and beyond, really across the Western United States. And it's believed that these high intensity megafires that we have today were not very common before European settlement. When there were these high intensity fires, they were probably small in area. So let me show you a picture of what forests would have looked like historically with more of these frequent low intensity fires. So you can see The forest behind me, it's a little bit more open. There's a lot of grass on the forest floor. There's space between the trees. In the last 200 years, our forests have gone through a dramatic change, right? As Hannah mentioned, extensive logging made the land susceptible to larger fires. And after the clear cutting and logging in the 1800s and more than 150 years of fire suppression, these forests were dramatically different than pre-colonial arrival. So somebody asked why the forests haven't seen fire in 150 years. Well, the reason for that is because of that colonial arrival and the fire suppression that came with it. When those European Americans arrived, they forced Native Americans to stop their cultural burning. And that was a really massive change on the landscape. So here's what can happen. I'll show you another image here. When we have too many trees growing too tightly all together on kind of packed in on the landscape, when they become overcrowded without those cultural burns or prescriptive burns. With a greater density of trees, nutrients and water is spread thinner, leaving trees susceptible to drought. Now our fires are higher severity, and due to rising temps from the climate crisis and bigger drought conditions, that makes the forest more susceptible to catching fire, and then those fires are more difficult to put out. Here's another model of how we can kind of imagine the difference between pre-colonial arrival and some of today's forests. So over on this side, we have what the forests look like with prescriptive burns or cultural burns. Our matchsticks, or our fuel in the fire triangle, are spread out, right? They're spread out a little bit more. There's more space around each tree. Whereas on the other side over here, we can imagine our trees or our matchsticks really tightly compact together. That's going to create a much bigger fire, a much hotter fire. And obviously, this one over on the side where they're more compact, that's going to be much more likely to burn if lightning comes through or something else starts a forest fire. Okay, so I'm going to share another photo here of what those mega fires look like. So many areas that would have experienced those small, low-intensity fires have now not experienced those fires for 150 years, like we've mentioned earlier, resulting in a large fuel buildup and those mega fires. I was going to use that same statistic that Courtney did, that 18 of California's 20 largest fires have all occurred in just the last 20 years. And this image behind me is the recent 2021 Dixie Fire that was in our park's backyard. And it's now considered the largest single fire in California history. So in recent years, the good news is that fire ecologists, fire scientists are collaborating more with the traditional ecological knowledge that Native American practices. And land managers and fire scientists have all recognized that prescriptive fire can again be a useful tool for keeping forests healthy and collaborating more with local tribes to prevent those high intensity fires. So this is just one of many, many examples of how we can respond and react to megafires and a changing climate. And from my research and understanding, one of the most important parts of staying motivated is to stay optimistic and hopeful that things can and will get better. And we can also remember how resilient Mother Nature really is, And there are certainly actions that we can and should take, because as our Indigenous communities remind us, people have been a part of nature and managing the forests for as long as human history can remember. So we're not separate from nature, we are a part of nature, and we have an obligation to continue to take care of our forests and our environment. So let me check my time here. See if I've got time to share. I want to just share a couple really quick resources with you guys for continued research on this topic. So there is a podcast I would highly recommend by Amy Cardinal Christensen. She's an Indigenous scholar and fire ecologist from the land now known as Canada. And she has some really wonderful studies and podcasts on this topic. There's a really awesome children's book, or for younger audiences, if you're a student or a teacher out there wanting to learn more about this topic, it's called Who Needs a Forest Fire by Paula Henson. This is another awesome resource. This is a book for your adult audiences, Tending the Wild, Native American Knowledge and the Management of California's Natural Resources by Kat Anderson. And for any listeners who are in the Plumas County region, I would highly recommend checking out the Plumas County Fire Safe Council to learn more about what you and your neighbors and your community can do to take action with citizens helping citizens to promote healthy, resilient forests and communities through the use of fire. So I'm going to wrap it up there so we have plenty of time for questions. Yeah, thank you guys so much for being here today and for asking questions and being curious. That is definitely the first step in and us all doing what we can with this big important issue.
Thank you so much, Darcy, for that great presentation on the Native peoples and their burning practices. It's so interesting to see how far back history, far in history using fire for its benefits actually goes. Brandon and Jeremy, are there any other questions in the Q&A for any of us?
Hey, also, we're looking through the Q&A. There's some really great questions in here. It's looking like Courtney is going through and answering a lot of these questions in a lot of detail, probably more than we have the time to really talk about here. So thank you, Courtney, for really just kind of going through.
That is the essence of being a scientist. Sorry.
You've answered 76 questions.
If you ask me a question, I will say it depends. Actually, there's one on here from Dana Garbo. How do fires actually help forests? And I think we should really make that part clear. Hannah or Darcy, do you want to say like how you see fires helping forests?
Yeah. I can do a few bullet points and then Darcy, you can jump in. With fires, low temperature fires actually burn things and then return those nutrients back into the ground, helping things regrow and reseed. Like Darcy was talking about, some things only grow when there's a fire that runs through to pop their seeds out. So it also brings in, like, knocks out the bigger trees. So there's more open patches of sunlight. Some trees only like sunlit areas. So that helps bring those trees and more tree diversity back into our forests.
Some animals too.
Yeah, and our animals as well. Like woodpeckers really love to come in and get those trees that have been dead. Bugs, there's a certain kind of beetle that also comes in after forest fires. And so the woodpeckers really love that because they get to eat those beetles. Bats also really prefer a forest that is thinned out by fire because it's easier for them to hunt because they can't see. They use that the sonar kind of thing to get around, fly around. So it really helps them when there's not as many obstacles in the way. Darcy, do you have anything else to add?
That's great. Yeah, the fancy science word for pine cones cones that only open up with fire is serotinous. So lodgepole that Courtney was talking about depends on fire for their cones to open, and without fire, then they won't reproduce. And yeah, I think you did a great job, Hannah.
There was a couple questions in there about wildlife. So I wanted to talk to folks about why fire is important for wildlife. I think people have seen Bambi and think of that massive fire coming, and it's a terrible thing to these animals. And one thing I'll say is that most animals have pretty acute senses to be able to sense fire and move away from it. One challenge now is that the habitat they used to be able to move into, when you put people's homes on top of that and freeways, there's a complexity to that now, to where the free movement of wildlife is not what it used to be 150 years ago in the Sierra. And sometimes animals can't move to habitat to escape fire in a way they once would. But the other thing I would say is that a complexity of diverse ecosystems or forest types is really what we're looking for to support the highest amount of biodiversity. That's a fancy science way of saying, like, not everybody wants to eat at McDonald's. Some people want to eat at Taco Bell. Some people want to eat at a super fancy restaurant. Some people want Indian food. Same thing with animals. Some animals want to live in a really open forest. Some want a very closed forest. Some need large woody debris and cavities in it in order to nest. Some are going to nest in chaparral. So one of the things fire does is it helps us to maintain a mosaic of diverse forest types and ecosystems to provide the greatest amount of diversity and the greatest amount of resilience to these larger wildfires. So when we lack fire, one of the things that's happening now is it's contributing to these mega fires. A lot of fuels, we're having greater high severity fires. They're on a larger scale. If a fire is now burning 100,000 acres, there's high severity patches in there that cannot be repopulated by the trees around them because the nearest trees are 10 acres away. So we're losing those forest types in these mega fires, in these very large high severity fires. And that's actually pretty bad for wildlife. If we can't regenerate the forest types that certain wildlife depend on, then we are going to lose those species. So these species depend on the fire happening to provide that mosaic.
Fantastic. Well, thank you guys so much. And I believe we have a Kahoot that we can play real quick. We've got a fun quiz that we're going to be pulling up. Hannah, do you have that?
Yes.
All right.
All right.
We want to say thank you to everyone who's tuned in. This is an amazing opportunity for us to connect with you all. And we wanted to wrap it up with a fun game.
All right. So if you've never played a Kahoot before, I'm going to walk you through it on your computer. You can go to www.kahoot.it and then type in that game pin. Or you can scan, if you're on a smartphone, you can go to that same website, or you can scan that QR code. So once I see some names pop in there, we've got 7 questions just to see how you retain the information. Put your nickname or your real name, because it will announce a winner. So give it a second, get some people popping in here. All right. $36 people, 40, awesome. All right, so in a second, I will start the questions and you will have 20 to 30 seconds to answer. On your phone or on your extra tab, whatever you pulled up, you will select the corresponding color that pops up. You'll see it'll make more sense once we get there. All right, still have a few people popping in.
Yeah, it looks like a lot of people are very excited about the Kahoot.
All right. Nothing like a friendly competition to inspire.
Awesome. Let's give them maybe 30 more seconds. If you guys are coming into the Kahoot, we're going to wait about 30 seconds and get this ball rolling.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. It seems to have kind of stopped. So I'm going to start. All right, so here we go. Fire quiz. So it should pop up on your phone here shortly. So what are the benefits of prescribed burns? Is it the red answer? When plants grow back, they grow back more diverse. Is it the yellow answer? It decreases the risk for megafires. Is it the blue answer? Some plants need fire in order for their seeds to sprout. Or is it the green answer, all of the above? All right, looks like everybody has answered. Just about. All right, 46 of you say all of the above, and that is correct. Awesome. So we've got Riley plus Tahoe in the lead. Nice. All right, next question. What is the difference between low intensity and high intensity fires? Is it low intensity fires have lower temperatures? That's the red answer. Is it yellow answer? High intensity fires kill the soil's bacteria. Is it the blue answer? Low intensity fires are safer for the forest. Or is it the green answer? All of the above. All right. 47 of you say all of the above, and you are correct. Let's see who's in the lead now. Mr. Rubik's in the lead, but only barely. Soha, you're in second place. Karen, very close third place. Nice. All right. What do you think fires will become more frequent or larger as our world becomes warmer? Red for yes, yellow for no, blue for maybe, green for not sure. All right, 57 of you say yes, and you are correct. Let's see who's in the lead now. Ooh, Soha still in the lead. Mr. Rubik's, you're a close second. Awesome. All right, let's see what's next. True or false? Most plants and animals in the U.S. have adaptations that allow them to survive fires. Is it true? Is it false? The picture may give you a hint. Five, four, three, two, one. Okay. True. Yes. 71 of you said true. Let's see who's in the lead now. Ooh, still Soha, and then Mr. Rubik's in the second place. Very nice. All right, let's see what is next. What type of fire climbs medium-sized trees? Is it climbing fires, the red answer? Ladder fires, the yellow answer? Or crown fires, the blue answer? All right, 46 of you got that correct. It is ladder fires. It crawls up the trees like a ladder. Mr. Rubik's, you are in the lead. And Karen, you are now second place. We've got some people moved around underneath there. Very interesting. All right, what type of fires jump from treetop to treetop? Is it the red answer, ladder fires? Is it the yellow answer, crown fires? Or is it the blue answer, climbing fires? All right, 63 of you got that correct. It is crown fires. You can think of it jumping from the head to the other head of the tree, the tip top, where a crown normally goes on a person's head. All right, let's see if it changed. Mr. Rubik's, you still look like you're in the first place area, and Karen still second. All right, last question. Native peoples used fire to, red answer, help regrow crops for the following year by burning their land. Yellow answer, celebrate, and it was also used in rituals. Blue answer, stay warm and to cook, or green answer, all of the above. All right, 61 of you got it correct. It is all of the above. So let's see who got first place. We got Riley Tahoe in third, Karen in second, and I guess we can all figure this one out. Mr. Rubik's first place. Awesome. Nice job, everybody. Thank you for participating. We really are so happy you joined us today. After the Zoom call exits out, you will have a chance to take a short survey. It will pop up in a Google Doc, and just kind of let us know what you thought about today. And we really use that information to help make these programs better for the next time we go around. Thank you again for joining us. If you loved our home learning programs, there are so many more from so many different California state parks online, so definitely check us out. All right, that is all I have. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all our